Good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to our Signpost Series webinar this morning. My name is Andy Boland, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so as we discuss and debate another issue on farming and the environment. I'd like to acknowledge the help and support that we get from our partners in producing this series, the National Rural Network, Food Drink Ireland, SkillNet, and Dairy Sustainability Ireland. So this morning, we're going to begin a series really for the next 4 weeks, looking at our wonderful and beautiful uplands, the people who work there and the people who live there. And I'm delighted this morning to be joined by Caitriona Douglas. Caitriona is from the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and also by Catherine Keena, our countryside specialist. And Catherine is known both in the uplands and indeed in the lowlands. Caitriona and ladies, sorry, you're both very welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Andy.
Hi, Andy. Thank
Caitriona,
you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Caitriona, you're an ecologist with the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and you're going to talk to us this morning about the ecological value and the condition of our uplands. You might just begin by telling us a little bit before you get into your presentation about what you do and how you finished up working in the uplands.
Indeed, it's a long and torturous route. I started working in the Wildlife Service in the 80s, so it's a long time ago. And I was working on field surveys for about 11 years, doing botanical surveys of the wetlands. The Wildlife Service had been established in the 70s, so there was an awful lot of groundwork to be done to identify the biodiversity areas that should be protected. So I was involved in that work in the 80s and started working on raised bog surveys when the EU asked us what we were doing about our raised bogs, because we hadn't any knowledge at that point except for Unfors Forba had been, surveying sites. So we did big surveys then, and then I moved on to working on the blanket bogs. And then when I got a permanent position, then I sort of graduated a little bit towards the uplands. Although, I'm essentially a bog woman. But I've been stretched to the uplands. Let's put it that way. And it's quite a large resource, So I'm not going to be able to cover it all, but I will just tip in here and there.
Oh, okay. Caitriona, you might begin to share your presentation with us. Catherine is going to keep an eye on the Q&A, so I could encourage as many of you as possible to put your comments or questions so as we can have a good lively debate at the end of Caitriona's presentation. So Caitriona, if you might begin to share your presentation.
Okay.
Now, apologies, we had a bit of a technical issue with Caitriona's presentation, so she'll be sharing it possibly not in slide view, but that will do fine, Caitriona. If slide
yes,
view,
well,
yeah, that's fine.
I've tried it in slide view, but I can see it in full view here. But
yeah,
unfortunately,
no, you work away.
Yeah. Okay. So you can see that, and you can probably see the slides on the side, along the side of the screen.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so yeah. Anyway, I just working. I'm just going to talk about the uplands and the habitats there, and something about the flora, and I'll give an outline of the talk now. So some definitions of what an upland means, because it can include habitats that occur in the uplands, but also blanket bogs and peatlands and heathlands can be considered, in the broadest definition, upland habitats, because they occur in cool climates. then the range of variation, just something about the you know, geomorphology, geology and altitude very briefly. Then a listing of the habitats that occur, and the standard classification in Ireland now used is called Fawcett. It's after it's Julie Fawcett's work, so it's often called Fawcett classification. And then the annex habitats is listed in the interpretation manual of the Habitats Directive. Then the something about the flora, just again touching on some species. Then something on the survey, which I'm project managing. It's survey of upland habitats, mapping habitats and assessing condition, and something about condition, methodologies, and habitat pressures, impacts on blanket bogs. See, I'm coming down to the bogs again. Just an overview of legislation, touching on carbon, peatlands and climate, multiple benefits of restoring peatlands, and some of the needs and challenges, maybe funding opportunities, acknowledgements. So without further ado, so definitions. This is the Coomera Mountains, by the way, lock in there. Credit to the surveyors on the Upland survey. Submontane land is considered to be that line between altitude 300 and 600 meters. And montane land is the highest, it's above around 600 meters. And for the National Survey of Upland Habitats, that's the acronym there, National Survey of Upland Habitats, unenclosed land above the 150 metre contour and associated lowland peatlands are considered in the definition of uplands for our purposes, because you know these sites are connected and the habitats are connected. They're not isolated entities. And on the western seaboard, there are extensive lowland blanket bogs and associated peatlands, such as the wet heaths, transition mires, fens, flushes, and the like. And just a stat there, about 14% of the Republic of Ireland lies over the 150 metre contour. So, sorry, that's a mistake. It's 200 meters. Sorry, it's probably quite a bit more over 150. It could be up to 19%, but I'm not sure. That should read 200 meters. Then just giving you just a few of the peaks that are above 600 meters. So these would be montane. The highest being Carrauntoohil, Lugnaquilla, the highest in Leinster. It's 925 meters. Carrauntoohil, 1039 meters. Haven't measured it, haven't been up to the top, disgracefully. For I might yet. Galtymore, that's, you know, the highest inland mountain range in Tipperary, Limerick, 9.8. Mulray, the highest in Connacht, very large mountain range, 800, just over 8. The Coomera's in Watford, of which this image is shown, 792. Mangerton in Kerry, 782. Crowpatrick, iconic mountain, 764. Kipure in Wicklow with the mast, 575. And then there's one at the bottom there. It can't see on my screen properly. Yeah, Crocon and Ackle. So that's just giving you a few, and there are quite a lot of mountain ranges in Ireland. I'm discovering, and they're all around the edge of the country. Well, mostly. There's quite a few inland ones, maybe, and more in the south, Midlands and southwest. Variation, geography, so they're located all around the country really, but a lot of them are coastal, with some significant exceptions like Sleep Blooms and the Mullaghwarks and the Galtees, as was mentioned, and Quilca near and up in Leitrim, Cavan. Geology can vary from acidic to alkaline rock. You have granites over in Galway and Wicklow, and then in Kerry, you have old red sandstone. Obviously, the Burren is limestone, but I won't be talking about the Burren because it's sort of exceptional, and I don't work on it. A lot of work's been done on the Burren, so it's not in this talk. So there are hard metamorphic rocks, there are shales, and there's soft kind of deposits as well. There's glacial deposits, there's peatlands, peat cover, glacial till, you know, esker sort of gravels as well. Altitude I've covered already. Geomorphology, well, the topography and the shapes, because the land is glaciated, most of it. You know, you have incredible corries, you know, hanging lakes and valleys, and you know, moraines and all sorts of deposits. Distance from the sea, oceanicity that can be called, you know, can affect the climate, the humidity, you know, temperature, and rainfall. So that has a significance for the ecology. Slopes can be steep or gentle. Again, huge ecological effect, free draining, or, you know, waterlogged if they're flat. Aspect, you know, north, south, east, west. North and east would be more humid, south and west maybe more wind exposure and sun, warmer. And then climate, and microclimates, because of all those variations, temperature, rainfall, humidity are important, and habitats and vegetation, responding to all that, as well as to land use. So moving on then to upland habitats. Upland in the biggest sense, word I am including the associated lowland. In the west, as I said, there are extensive lowland blanket bogs, lakes and the like in Mayo, you know, Donegal, Kerry, Galway, Clare even. So we have two systems here. This is the national sort of classification system for habitats, and a lot of people use this now. It's very, very useful. And then some of our habitats are, you know, listed for protection under the EU Habitats Directive, and they're called, we call them Annex 1 because they're listed on Annex 1 of that directive. And these are the habitats that we are including in the Upland survey for condition assessment. We would be mapping a lot of these habitats when we're doing our surveys. However, where we do assessments, we're focusing on these, which are the heaths, wet heaths and the dry heaths, the alpine and boreal heaths, which are up at the higher altitudes, a kind of heathy grassland called species-rich nardus grassland. Then we have our bog, blanket bog. Active means it's, you know, forming peat, it's wet, it's you know, there's good vegetation cover and it's in good condition. But both habitats, even if it's degraded, it's still considered annexed habitat. Ideally, we want to return, you know, degraded habitats to peat forming or active habitats. Transition marshes, you know, they're just in between fens and bogs or lakes, you know, that are colonizing with rafts of vegetation. So, you know, they're dangerous to walk on, but they've rare species and they're in annexed habitats. This habitat called Rincospóin, it's just Rincospora. It's it's a small plant that grows on the edge of pools and in wet depressions in bogs. So it's like a sub-habitat of bog. It really shouldn't be a separate one, but it's considered to indicate deep peat. So, you know, the EU have said it's very important. Alkaline fens, well, groundwater, you know, influence is felt here on these especially, and calcareous influence. They can be very species rich, and the ones that occur within the bogs, are protected from lateral effects of fertilizer, say on land use, intensive land use in many instances, not in all instances, but as a result of that, they can be in very good condition, compared to maybe fens distributed to the general countryside, which would have had a lot of reclamation. So then you're getting up into the higher altitudes, you're getting scree slopes, and they can be limestone or acidic. Calcareous slopes or limestoney ones, and the silicious are the acidic rocks, so they're more poor. They don't have as much mineral to give the plants, but they have their own characteristic flora. Just to say, we're not talking about woodlands today, because there's so many specialisms really. So we're not, and there are, of course, woodlands in the uplands, as well as forestry, conifer forestry. Lakes, again, I'm not touching on lakes because that's a whole area, a specialist area. Grasslands in general, I'm not, but there are some grasslands that we are talking about. They kind of they mix in with dry heat as well, acidic grassland, and there's a species rich grassland up there, which is also kind of linked with dry heat. Cladium fens, again, they're almost more like lakes, and limestone pavement, the barn. So they're the things I'm not talking about. So moving on then, just the elements of the flora, from the up, I mean, it's a vast resource really when you think about it, and with such variation and very specialized species. There are montane species. Maybe we don't have the high mountains of Scotland, but we have some of the montane elements. We don't have a lot of the alpine elements that they have, or the Arctic, but we do have some, and we have a lot of Atlantic bryophytes in common with Scotland, mosses, leafy liverworts, and more so perhaps than would be found in England and Wales. So I think it's that hyper-oceanic climate, the humidity and everything coming off the Atlantic and the clouds and everything that and exposure that can support these species. So if you looked at one of the reports from the survey, you'd see such a long list of mosses and liverworts, with exotic Latin names and English names that are very colourful and poetic, that have been applied to them. I don't know by who, but it's worth having a look at them. But it would take us quite some time to go through. But I'm just illustrating how rich, the uplands are in lower plants, but not just lower plants, also higher plants. Dwarf shrubs would be very typical, because a lot of, well, on our blanket bogs, they are naturally treeless because they are so nutrient poor. They're deep peat. So when they're that way, deep peat, acidic, nutrient poor, naturally treeless, they're kind of climatic climax. They're in equilibrium. Well, they were with our natural climate. Who knows now if they're in equilibrium? They're probably, intending not to be. That's why we need to get them back in good condition. But dwarf shrubs like heather, bilberry, all the different kinds of heathers, bog myrtle, and even species like cowberry, Vaccinium viticidea. It's also called lingonberry. It's quite locally distributed in the north of the country. So they are like the small shrubs of the uplands, and they offer shelter, and they help to bind even soil and reduce erosion, or just they're evergreen as well in winter, and they can be great for species browsing for animals out on the hills. So sedges and bog cottons are very typical flowering plants. Also, ferns are very, typical as well in rock crevices and gullies and shady places. Bryophytes I mentioned before, and the key group sphagnum, which is a real peat forming species group, I should say. And there's probably about 30 to 35, just under 35 species, I think, in Ireland, but more to be found, definitely. So work has to be done there. Lichens, the sort of reindeer lichen, people call them, they're very typical, but also on the tops you get Citrari Icelandica, Icelandic lichen, but that's quite local. Then you have a large leafy liverwort community. I'll talk about that later. It's localized on very humid areas, shady. So then there are protected species under the Habitats Directive and protected species under our Wildlife Acts. Then there's very specialized species to cope with extreme environment of a bog. It's exposed, it's acidic, it's waterlogged, it's nutrient poor, very little nitrogen and phosphorus. So plants have evolved insectivorous methods to gain nutrients. So sundews, butterworts, and bladderworts are three of the species groups that trap insects. So they're fascinating little creatures and getting their own back on the insect world. Boreal species and boreal relic species. Yeah, there's some very unusual species that are more typical in the tundra and boreal zones, or the edge of the tundra, maybe not quite the tundra. And they're occurring in niches here and there in refuges in our bogs, in some of our fens, and mountains. And then there's a strange group of species called the Lusitanian species, because they occur, well, they're usually on the heaths, but they have a disjunct distribution and mostly absent from Britain. Some maybe on the inner Hebrides, but they're found in Spain, northern Spain and Portugal, and typically southern and western Ireland. So was it the Spanish coming on the ships, and trading with Ireland, or did it survive here from some early periods? There's a lot of work and interest in this curious group, and one of them there is St. Dabioxide, or Dabuisia cantabrica, which is the Spanish name, and you can see the connection there, and it's much bigger bell on it than our crossleaf teeth, which I have a picture of down here. And then that's our bell heather in the background there. So you can see this thing, it's absolutely beautiful. It's very typical in Connemara with low gorse, the autumn flowering gorse, the dwarf gorse, Ulex gallii. So it's kind of coastal heat. Maybe it likes warmth, it seems to. It's not up on the mountains. There's another heather, Erica regina, it's in Mayo and maybe somewhere else. Also, it's called Mediterranean heath, and it's called Irish heath now, I believe. Marquez heath, the Lusitanian butterwort, that's one of the carnivorous plants, the large flowered one, typical in Kerry, but in some places outside Kerry, again, another insectivorous species, Saxifraga spatularis is St. Patrick's cabbage, and that's in our mountains, in rock crevices, and the Kerry lily, a very local in Kerry heaths. So moving swiftly on, leafy liverwort. These, in contrast, this is an interesting community. In contrast to montane areas of England and Wales, Irish mountains share much of the oceanic elements of the Scottish montane vegetation, including high abundance of, it's called woolly hair moss, sometimes Racemitrium lanuginosum. You'd probably notice it can cover large areas on top of hummocks and in eroding areas too on the hags. And the presence of mixed northern hepatic mat, a very localized vegetation of large leafy worts of north and east mountain facing slopes. Rory Hodge and Micheline Sheehy Skeffington published work on that, and that's just showing you some of the species there in their beautiful red color, and the leaf worts are very, very big. Mostly leafy worts are tiny, but these ones are not. So just mentioned sphagnum species earlier, and this is just to show that we're still discovering new species of sphagnum, which is amazing. Dr. Rory Hodge is a fantastic expert on mosses and liverworts, and he's worked on some of our surveys, and he discovered in 2020 in the Slievotty Mountains, in one of the SACs there, this species, Sphagnum majus, and it grows in pools, and we have very few pool species. In fact, we have probably 3, maybe sphagnum species in pools. Well, we've typically cuspidatum, which is often called the drowned kitten moss because it looks like matted fur, but that's not a nice name really. It doesn't conjure up a good image. But then we've another one, a cowhorn moss, and that's a very good description of it. And now we have sphagnum majus here. So that's great credit to Dr. Rory Hodge. He's a fantastic botanist, and we definitely need more Rories. So just looking at protected species, we have under the protection order under the Wildlife Act, we have a slender bog cotton and flushes and bog. We have a club moss like Diella inojata on the edges of lakes, St. John's wort species on the edges of lakes, and a Disjampsia. It's a type of grass, I think tufted hair grass. And they're all protected, and they're in Connemara. I know these from Connemara, and this probably as well, and this one, but probably in other places. And then these are some of these boreal relic species. They're in base-rich flushes. They're quite unique systems. Some of them are very large, especially in Mayo, and they're associated with the calcareous glacial drift, eskers, and water sort of percolates through them and brings out the calcium, and then sort of filters through the bog over, flat bog, and then long distances. So meandering, you might see reeds, as a signal of a flush. But when you look closer, then all these things are here. So Paludella squarosa was, extremely rare in Europe, I think, and maybe in the UK, maybe not in the UK, but it was discovered by Neil Lockhart, Dr. Neil Lockhart, he's a biologist, NPWS, out in one of these flushes, and another liverwort, and another of those Stromatipma nitans, again, just showing you scarce and declining species of calcareous fens, usually those which are rich in sedges and brown mosses. It's very rare in southern Britain, but remains tolerably frequent in upland marshes in the central Scottish Highlands and the borders of northern England, where it tends to grow, where flushes spread onto flat ground. And it's, there's quite a few locations for this one, in the west of these flushes, but it's still very local species. I think it does occur in Pollardstown Fen as well. So these are species that are typical northern, areas, and they're found in, out Mayo. It's very exposed. Sometimes I think Mayo is our tundra, when I'm out there, if you're out there in Ayers Head on a windy day in winter. And another fantastic find, again, Dr. Caoimhe Muldoon, rest in peace, and Dr. Rory rediscovered this moss in Base Ridge Flush on the Ox Mountains, and it was out in the Bournemouth bogs, at Onini, and in a flush there that was kind of survived and protected from the, milled that happened over about 6,000 hectares of that land. But unfortunately, the hydrology, as you can imagine, was impacted by the drainage, and this species disappeared, but it was refound during the Upland survey in 2012, I think, in the Ox Mountains. And again, fantastic. So these boreal relic species may be relict of the early post-glacial period, surviving these little refuges you know, out in the bogs or out in the mountains, and you know, so they're rather special. And just finishing off, Annex 2 species, Marsh saxifrag, again out in the bogs here in Mayo, in flushes, shining sickle moss, slightly basin-rich flushes, and an Annex 2 species of lakes, typical in Connemara and Mayo and other western seaboard or peatland lakes. So Milway Schiefer compact, a massive range, and that was surveyed in the Upland surveys. And they're just some of the that's an alpine club moss, so you'll only find this little one down here on the left, up on the tops, you know, on the higher mountains. It's in Wicklow. It's actually on Capure. It's probably over, you know, those 600 meter high mountains, I think. When I was Capure, that height is, yeah. So here then we have, this is interesting because these are areas that are inaccessible to grazing animals, and they just illustrate really, maybe if, you know, the grazing wasn't as heavy, we might have a kind of more lush vegetation on our hills. Admittedly, these are in crevices and rocks, so they can kind of water supply creeping down the rocks, and probably some extra nutrients as well. And there, you know, there's it's called it wasn't thought to be in the uplands. It's a tall herb community, and tall herb was thought to be just lowland community, but this is lately been discovered as an upland version of tall herb. And I know, you know, on the continent, some of the mountains have very herb-rich meadows, and you know, it just begs the question, you know, the effect of grazing and on some of our hills. Some of this is probably stunted, and this is St. Patrick's cabbage, one of the Lusitanian species that I mentioned, growing in a crevice in the rocks on Wilray. And I'm not really going to talk about fauna, and you know, this is very blurry on this screen. And here's labyrinth spider in heath. It's on Ulex, on dwarf gorse. It's not actually going to pounce on passerby, but it's protecting its eggs in that huge web. So it's a good parent. And here's the caterpillar of the fox moth, which you will often see on heather on the bogs and in great numbers at certain times of the year. Just to say they're fantastic fun on the mountains, and I won't dwell on them. You know, common frog, lizard, hare, even badger can be out on the hills. Fox, red grouse is very characteristic because it's the heather hen, feeds on heather, nests in heather, and heather is essential for it. Mountain pipit, or I think meadow pipit, you know, it's nests again on the ground. A lot of the species nest on ground, and they need good vegetation and cover, and safety from predators. Golden plover, it's wader, also out in the hills, has a beautiful lonesome call. I haven't seen it for some years, but you know, these are in decline. But there's a lot of work going on to try and recover these species, iconic species. Kestrel, raven, we all know the raven. Otter. Otter is, I've seen otter on the bog in Mayo. It goes between pools and lakes, and then it connects out to the rivers and down to the bays. So yeah, it hunts and forages across wet bog, you know, frogs and the like, I suppose. Freshwater pearl mussel mentioned because it's in the river systems that come off the mountains. So whatever we do on our hills, you know, can release silt, and unfortunately this sensitive filter feeder suffering. Arctic salmon spawning eggs are very sensitive to silt, and they're in a lot of our western rivers, and again suffering. Vertigo is a snail, tiny snail, but annex species, and very important little creature, and an indicator, you know, of flushes and certain types of conditions. Chuff are also in inland cliffs. Artichar is kind of trout, rare type of trout. I think it's in some of the quarries, but it's disappearing from others. It's very sensitive. Greenland white-fronted goose was very common feeding on the wet bogs, but unfortunately it's declined on the bogs. I think more populations in Wexford on the grasslands, but there may be some small flocks on certain sites still. And then there's a lot of birds of prey. And then of course the curlew and other waders, you know, they a lot of these nest, well, peregrine nests on cliff, merlin, I'm not sure where merlin nests, but a lot of the waders nest on the ground, for instance, the curlew, and are very sensitive to predation. So, you know, forestry can harbour predators is one of the impacts. And there's a curlew project that's making headway on protecting some of these iconic species. Just on the Upland survey, the objectives of the Upland survey, and it started in 2009 with the scoping survey devising methodologies, and it's to classify and map the location and area of upland habitats within a range of upland sites using standard schemes, Fawcett and the Annex habitat classification, but also plant communities. And there's new kind of developing Irish vegetation classification for plant communities, because these are like the building blocks of habitats. And these are where all these beautiful species and species communities kind of are occurring and have to be identified and understood to be able to protect them. Then to assess the conservation status of a suite of upland and associated lowland annex habitats, and to improve knowledge on the plant communities and flora that make up the habitats. And as I said, the main habitats that we're doing the Upland survey would be the heaths and the bogs, you know, alpine heaths, wet dry heaths, blanket bog transition marshes, alpine fens, and the rocky habitats. So, you know, and maybe the upland tall herb, although we don't, I think we're assessing it, but we're mapping it at the moment. Methodologies devised during the scoping study are explained in this wildlife manual, which is on our website, www.npws.ie. So, you know, all the methods are, you know, in detail described there. And then some revision of this, there's no actual published revision, but we are adding some extra sort of data, you know, to the survey as we go, but we can add them to the manual at some point. There's not that many, but we are kind of trying to keep the methodology so that we have comparison between years. So when we go back to look at plots, we can understand whether things have changed by measuring similar parameters. This year, the survey is it's just started, and it's going to map the Slieve Bloom mountain habitats and assess condition there. So that just says the plots are distributed across the site. So you've plots, you know, in different habitats. So you have to decide what the habitats are first, and then you have to kind of, you know, maybe have a random array of plots, you know, across each of these habitats that we're assessing. And then, you know, this will inform strategies.
Sorry, Caitriona, just
sorry,
to remind you,
Andy,
I'd just like to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end, just to remind you.
Yeah.
That's all.
Tell me what time to finish.
Well, go another. We've about 15
5 minutes.
Oh no, we've about 15 minutes left. So 15, 20 minutes. I'd just like to have.
Oh, is that all you've left for time?
Yeah.
Were
just like to leave
late?
a few minutes at the end for questions. That's all.
Sure. Yeah. I can go very quickly actually through a lot of these because the foundation's there. So that's just showing you the sites surveyed to date. So there's 20 sites surveyed, and so they range from Carlingford to Coomera, the Galties, and then Caha, sites in Killarney National Park, Mount Brandon. These are all SACs, Slieve Mish, and then there's the Slieve Aughty Mountains there in the Mid-West, Muilray. Neffen isn't a designated site that was surveyed. it's got very good alpine heath, Curon, out on Achill and Schliefmore, and Ox Mountains, Quilcanerin, and then Ben Bulben and Aru, Schliefleague, and then we're going to Schlief Blooms this season. So again, I think I've touched on this already. It's just see how, reporting for Article 17 under the Habitats Directive. So all the things we have to measure. And then this is just on active bog. It's some of the criteria we might look at, would be sphagnum cover, microtopography, the fibrous layer on the top, and we might increase the size of a relevate 4x4 because active bog have priority status, and it's defined as still supporting a significant area of vegetation that is normally peat forming. So it's characteristic bog vegetation. And it's very important for carbon sequestration. Again, that's showing you plots being assessed. Common age data is also looked at from the past and compared to see whether we can evaluate trends. That's just showing the number of sites and the number of plots that have been assessed. And that's just a table that would show a result from a site, and that one would be the Cover Mountains. So under area, structure and function, future prospects, and an overall assessment. So you can see red isn't good and green is favorable conservation status. So there's quite a lot of, unfavorable condition habitats. The wet heaths, the dry heaths, the alpine and boreal heaths. Well, future prospects looks okay on that one. Blanket bog not looking good. Maybe the Rockies are, partly okay. It's just showing impacts maybe of stock grazing, that's the Mulray, the Nardus is growing on the bare peat there, but if you have excessive levels, there isn't a lot of palatable species, and if animals are hard pressed, it ends up with erosion and trampling, and peat silts going into the rivers. That's a nest of a meadow pipit, just showing you, they're ground nesting, and also that they need all this vegetation, not bare peat, to support their lives. And this is Mulray again, and it's a good illustration just of various impacts. In the foreground, there's heather, it's very tightly grazed, a lot of maybe Nardus. In the background, then you can see eroding areas on the edges, and that can be from various causes. Generally, human impact of various kinds. Your forestry in the background can be impacting the hydrology, and then here you have a grazing, you have a fence, so you have a grazing differential, you have heavy grazing on the left side of that image as compared to the right. So you can imagine impacts on water quality as well, and then this is just from Wicklow here and from the Cromera Mountains burning. Has devastating effect on nesting birds as well as the whole system. You get there's no peat formation, there's runoff, and there's no shelter. There's greenhouse gases a bit emitted, and this is Wicklow here and up tight, and then the middle one is in Schliefleague, and on the bottom right is just sausage machine cutting. And they have a much greater impact probably than face bank cutting had in the old days. And this one here, you're just seeing again drainage, but also there's a line there that shows the bogs being cut by sausage machine cut. It's like a chainsaw, can go down very deep, a metre or more, and it makes it difficult to block drains and hold water, and it can destabilise the slope. And on the top right then is a restored bog at Capure. The base of Capure was a flat area, it wasn't badly damaged, but there were drains and they're blocked, and it's really a very good illustration of a good site. And then this is just listing all the not them all, but some of the key policies, legislation, conventions, plans, including climate. So I'll move on past that. And then carbon, well, if the bog has cover, and this is from Wicklow Mountains where Andromeda, the bog rosemary grows, if it has a good cover of typical bog vegetation, and especially the mosses, it's probably storing carbon, it's probably taking it from the atmosphere, but it's very easy to change that into a carbon or greenhouse gas emitting system. Ireland has 8% of the global resource of blanket bog, and Scotland is the most important country in Europe for this habitat. And since the UK has now left the EU, Ireland holds the bulk of the EU resource of blanket bog. So we have a big responsibility there. And peatlands, including blanket bog, have a unique capacity to fix and store carbon in the accumulating peat. And even though they cover only 3% of the Earth's lands, they're responsible for more than 30% of worldwide carbon storage. And the key thing is, depends on maintenance of a stable high water table, that is no more than 5 to 10 centimetres below the bog surface for at least 9% of the time, as low water allows air infiltration and hence microbial decomposition, which releases carbon as carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And then you have dissolved organic carbon entering the streams, as well as silt in degraded bogs. So I think restoration is where it's leading projects, Kerry Life, Interreg, EU Life, Wild Atlantic Nature is a huge program now in the Northwest. I think you might be having a talk on that. And then we have a small pilot project with Intel just testing out restoration again in Wicklow and measuring water quality and measuring greenhouse gases. So we're hoping to be able to kind of link the greenhouse gas signal emission with vegetation communities. And the European Investment Bank is now committed to supporting investment in restoration. It's what they say, to revitalize nature and improving resilience to a changing climate. So bogs are sensitive to climate change, but they're also sort of help in reducing the worst impacts if we can, get them back to peat forming systems. So this peatland community engagement scheme that NPWS run this year's closed applications, but it's 500,000 total. It was available this year, and a maximum grant of 25,000 in 2002. A max of 75% of the project eligible costs, were provided, and a whole range of things there. You can see recreation, immunity, invasive species control, even mentions fire control, I think, in that, and raising awareness, community work around sites, site protection. So that's there are more instruments of funding coming. Finally, just acknowledge the work of the team and credit for the many photographs that they have taken, and I have used, I can't name them all, but the consultants were Beck consultants, and they had a huge team of field surveyors, excellent people like Dr. Ori Hodge and Joan Denier and Philip Pern, and a lot of people. They were just images from the internet, and then there's just a list of reports there. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I went on a bit long.
That's all right, Caitriona. Thanks very much.
So I need to stop sharing here, I think.
If you wouldn't mind, yeah.
Thanks.
And it's reflected in the Q&A. There's a wealth of experience and knowledge in all of those slides, Caitriona. I mean, you can see from the detail in it. And that's been
a lot of work done.
Acknowledged there in the Q&A. One area that
there we are.
Catherine is going to look at through the Q&As there, but one thing that has often struck me, and it's a kind of when you mentioned ACL as well. I mean, you often wonder whether it's environmental benefits in the lowland or particularly in the uplands. Is there
Yeah.
any examples internationally? I mean, we've had a few in Ireland with, say, Achill Lamb, of, you know, where you can monetize for the communities that are living in those areas, that you could sell
Yes.
produce with a premium. I mean,
Yes, you can. And I think there is a move towards people love to have local brands, locally produced. And there are models on the continent. Now, I don't know them, but I know they're there. You know, people make a lot more sort of use of as well the Natura 2000 sites as a kind of brand, you know, if they're
mm,
farming on them. But obviously, it's critical that they're not causing damage, that it's sustainable. So it would have to be very low intensity and on the more robust, you know, habitats there, you know, like maybe
yeah,
the drier heaths and grasslands rather than the bogs or the wet heaths. So yeah,
it is possible. Yeah,
again,
yeah,
yes, I definitely. And I think maybe the Community Wetlands Forum in Ireland might have some information on that. There's there's information on a lot of websites as well on that sort of thing. Natura 2000 branding, even honey produced, you know, from heather and all these things from protected sites. They have an added value and an attraction for people.
yeah. Catherine,
Okay.
lots of questions coming in there. You might have to pull a few of them together because we haven't got a
Yes.
whole lot of time.
And the main thing is that the talk and the presentations will be up on the website, Andy, if some people are asking that. And also to re-emphasize that this is the start of four talks, and some of this is kind of laying the basis for where we start from, and maybe some of the management side will be discussed in the future weeks. So really appreciate the detail that we'll have for use by us. Just one question there. Have any of the plots that you have surveyed or has been surveyed been revisited, and is there any change in habitat condition?
We, because we had no baseline surveys for the SACs, because designation happened, you know, in quite a rush for Ireland. These are baseline surveys, so we haven't revisited these plots, but we will be, I think, starting next year revisiting.
Okay.
But we have looked at Common framework data on heather height, heather cover, and bare peat, and compared them with our parameters. And sometimes we've seen improvement in height and cover of heather. So, you know, we're using that as an indicator of trend. Sometimes there's a decline, there might be more bare peat in some instances, but there's a mixed result. But there, you know, it is quite useful to use that data, which is from about the year 2000, 2006. So, you know, it's up on 20 years. But they didn't map habitats then, they mapped damage rather than habitats.
What are the effects of forestry on conserving upland blanket bogs is one question.
Multiple effects, you know, there's effects on fauna anyway, and on predators, and a lot of birds won't nest near them, and predators, you know, make their way out of there. But there's a huge hydrological effect, depends on whether they're upslope, downslope, whether they're drains, what direction the drains run, how old the plantation is, whether it's closed canopy. If it's a young plantation, it's open canopy, and you still have bog vegetation, and it's on flat ground, and you know it's not growing well, there's very good restoration potential there. If it's been there a long while, you can get fracturing in the peat, drying out, you can get conduits of water, so you can have quite an uphill struggle, forgive the pun, to try and restore such areas. But they can also have an impact on focusing drainage water onto areas, and maybe cause erosion, potentially even peat failures. So it's a whole area. We're doing some research on peat failures, not related to forestry, but related to a wind farm and to forested sites, but there was no activity there at the time, but there's legacy issues.
And Caitriona,
So they have to be looked at.
And Caitriona, would the same effect be on where there's severe undergrazing and scrub encroachment? Would that have kind of the same effects as forestry?
Now, if a blanket bog is in good condition, it's wet and waterlogged, and if trees won't grow on it, neither will scrub. So, but when the bog is drying out, yes, scrub will invade, and you'll have Pinus contorta, especially lodgepole pine, that just spreads out onto heaths from adjacent plantations. So, you know, it's a problem. Yeah, if the bog is wet
problem, yeah,
and it's restored, it's more resilient to a lot of these kind of impacts or effects.
More of a comment: important to consider the existing and future use of uplands for recreation and tourism, and how this should be integral in the sustainable planning, management and protection of uplands. And just one question for you there,
Yes.
about what role does NPWS have in the protection of uplands where new greenways and blueways are envisaged?
Well, you know, for say the protected sites, any developments will be an activity requiring consent at the least, you know, and or requiring, you know, planning permission at the most, you know, or appropriate assessment if it's in an SAC. So these things, the impact of such a thing, there should be alternative routes proposed and see which is the least impacting, you know. We're very in favor of them, you know, and there are areas that are robust and can take that, but there are other areas that are extremely sensitive, and a track even can start erosion. And up in Slieve League, you know, there's quite a lot of erosion from, you know, walkers, just, you know, popular routes. So care, and NPW does have a role, especially for the SBAs, NHAs, SECs.
Okay, Andy, I know you're coming. You can tell me now. Just
time for one more, Catherine. Go on.
Yeah, one more. Well, it's more of a comment that the question is what longer term financial incentives are there for farmers to restore peatlands? So we'll be covering some of them the next 3 weeks. But perhaps have you any comment on financing?
I think finance is finally becoming available, and I think we'll have is a skills shortage and the capacity to actually use the finance, because of the importance of bogs for climate and the fact that Ireland is such a resource, and because there's quite extensive degraded areas, there's a lot of work to be done, and so we need to build capacity, upskill, and be ready to do this. And we have to upscale the work, because it's, you know, we have no time really to waste, but at the same time it's costly, and if we make mistakes, you know, you can't really go back and do it again, and nobody will give you any more money. So it has to be sound science, you know, to underpin it. So NPWS, you know, get funding. We draw down funding, as other people do, from EU. Interreg, there's been quite a lot of work done. Fidandari Bog in the Ox Mountains had nearly 3,000 dams installed just last winter on a flat area of drained bog that hadn't been planted, just drained, and really good work was done there. But the machine operators have to be highly skilled as well, and they've been working on the raised bogs, so we, you know, they come over from there. So there's a lot of work and a lot of upskilling required in the science and in the practical work.
Caitriona,
so great opportunities.
Thank you once again. And just to say, a full recording of the webinar this morning will be available on our website, together actually with a podcast, which you can download from your whatever source you get your podcast from. And also Caitriona's presentation will also be available, because there's some wonderful photos and detail within the presentation. Just Catherine mentioned that we're beginning a series in the Uplands. Next week we'll be looking at the Comera upland communities, and our colleague Katrina Foley from Teagasc will be joined by the project manager, an ex-colleague of ours, Owen Carton, and they will go through what's happening in the Comeras. So from Katrina, Catherine and myself, just to thank Yvonne Maher in the background, who pulls all the strings to keep us all in line. Thank you very much, Yvonne. So until next week, thank you for joining us, and hope you can join us again this time next week for another series on the Uplands. Thank you very much, and have a safe weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.